There is a specific way aged maple smells when it has absorbed 30 years of flour, cured meats, cold salt, and olive oil, a deep, dry, resinous sweetness that never quite leaves the grain, no matter how hard you scrub it with lye water or bleach at the end of a long night shift. For 25 years, that smell lived in the small, narrow kitchen behind the glass counter at D'Agostino and Sons, a neighborhood Italian grocery tucked away on the lower end of South Street in Philadelphia. If you press your palm flat against the center of the big butcher block near the back register, where the prosciutto and capicola are sliced, you can feel a subtle, smooth dip in the wood, hollowed out by tens of thousands of precise strokes of a heavy steel knife over 4 decades. Arthur created that dip. He was 54 when I met him, and I was 22. His hands were heavy, coarse-skinned, with clean, short-cropped nails and thick silver hair at the temples that he kept combed back with tap water every morning before 5 o'clock. My daughter, Chloe, was 4 years old when I first walked through his doors on a bitter Tuesday in late November, holding her small. Mittens bound hand in mine, while the cold Philadelphia wind rattled the rusted metal ice signs on the brick exterior. I needed work, any work, that allowed me to keep her nearby, or at least offered hours that fit around a cheap neighborhood daycare that didn't charge steep monetary penalties for late pickups. Arthur looked down at me over his wire-rimmed reading glasses, checked the long paper register tape running from the machine, and told me to tie a blue canvas apron around my waist. He didn't ask where her father was. He didn't ask why my coats were always 3 sizes too big, bought from the thrift bins behind the church on 4th Street. He simply pointed to the deep porcelain back sink, handed me a clean linen rag, and told me to keep my hands clean and the glass wiped down. For 12 years, we worked side by side in a space no larger than a standard bedroom. We moved around each other like 2 old clockwork gears, learning the exact radius of the other's elbows, knowing without looking when to reach for the brown butcher paper, when to step back to let the other reach the low shelves of canned San Marzano tomatoes, when to hand over the heavy wedge of Parmigiano Reggiano without a single word being spoken. And in all those years, through every winter blizzard that locked the city in ice, through every scorching August afternoon when the compressors in the basement hummed and strained under the humidity, Arthur never once touched my skin intentionally. He never called me by a nickname, he never sat down to eat a meal with me, nor did he ever ask me to stay past 7 in the evening. There was a line drawn between us, a wide, silent territory made of decency, cold marble, and 40 years of a life he had built long before I ever stepped over his threshold. It was a line that neither of us ever named, and one that neither of us ever crossed. I should start with how it began, because the order matters. My name is Eleanor Vance. In the winter of 2008, I was struggling to keep a cramped, drafty 2-room apartment on Catherine Street. My marriage had collapsed quietly 2 years earlier, not with a dramatic row or slammed doors, but with a series of unpaid utility bills, an empty closet, and a man who simply walked out one wet Tuesday morning and never returned. I was young, perpetually exhausted, and constantly terrified that I was failing the small girl who looked up at me with wide, expectant eyes every time the dark settled over the alley. When Arthur hired me at the market, it wasn't out of charity, at least. He took great care to make it seem that way to the rest of the neighborhood. He was a man of precise, unbreakable habits. Every morning at 5:30 sharp, he unlocked the front metal grate with a heavy brass key that lived on a polished leather loop in his trouser pocket. By 6, the aluminum coffee pot in the back room was brewing, filling the cold air with the bitter, comforting scent of roasted chicory and dark beans. By 6:15, the first delivery trucks would idle in the alley, their exhaust blooming like thick white plumes in the morning twilight. Arthur was married to Clara. Clara was a tall, serene woman with a soft, aristocratic voice who suffered from a progressive joint condition that kept her mostly upstairs in their apartment directly above the store. She wasn't an invalid in the traditional sense. She was a woman of enormous dignity who spent her quiet afternoons sitting by the broad bay window overlooking the street, knitting wool blankets for the local children's hospital or keeping the shop's financial ledgers in a precise, fluid copperplate script. Arthur loved her with a silent, ironclad loyalty that was visible in everything he did. Every day at precisely 1 o'clock, no matter how long the line at the counter was, he would cut 3 paper-thin slices of roasted turkey breast, place them neatly between 2 slices of crusty Italian bread, lay a clean linen napkin over the plate, and carry it up the wooden stairs that creaked rhythmically under his weight. He was a man defined entirely by duty, and that duty was a beautiful, solid thing to witness. My role was simple: run the register, wrap the sharp cheeses, sweep the sawdust off the floorboards at closing, and keep the front display glass sparkling. But slowly, over months that bled seamlessly into years, a routine took hold between us that belonged to no one else. It started with the morning soup. Every morning around 10, after the initial rush of neighborhood regulars had cleared out with their loaves of seeded bread and morning papers, Arthur would begin prepping the daily broth. He stood at the wooden block, his broad shoulders squared, slicing celery, carrots, and yellow onions with rapid, rhythmic thuds of his heavy chef's knife. He never spoke while he prepped. But when he finished, he would pour a small blue enamel mug full of the hot, steaming vegetable liquid, set it on the cold marble counter near the register, and walk into the walk-in cooler without saying a word or looking back. He knew I hadn't eaten breakfast. He knew I gave Chloe the last of the milk and toasted bread before we walked out the door at 6 in the morning. He never mentioned it. He never asked if I was hungry. He just left the mug. And when I finished it, I would wash it at the deep sink, dry it thoroughly with a lint-free towel, and place it back on the shelf next to his own oversized white ceramic cup. That was our language. It was a language made entirely of small, functional acts that required no explanation. There was a particular way he held doors open, standing entirely clear, his back pressed hard against the wooden frame, looking out toward the street so I could pass through without our coats ever brushing. There was the way he handed me change or keys, dropping them into my open palm from half an inch above, ensuring his fingers never grazed mine. It was an exquisite, continuous effort of avoidance that felt more intimate than a touch ever could have been. I noticed everything about him over those 12 years. I noticed that he took his coffee black, with half a spoon of coarse sugar. But if the morning had been particularly bitter, or he had been up half the night with Clara's pain, he would stir in a single spoonful of dark chestnut honey from the jars we sold on the third shelf. I noticed the tiny crescent-shaped scar on his left thumb, where a boning knife had slipped 20 years before, and the subtle way he rested his right hand on his hip when his lower back was acting up during heavy rainy weather. And he noticed me. On mornings when my eyes were red from staying up late doing freelance bookkeeping for the local dry cleaner or sewing costumes for Chloe's school plays, the blue enamel mug would have a little extra black pepper in it, or he would quietly take over the heavy wooden crates of winter citrus so I wouldn't have to lift them from the sidewalk. The rhythm of our work extended far beyond the simple mechanics of buying and selling. It was an intricate dance choreographed by seasons and human necessity. In the spring, when the shadow of the brick buildings across the street lifted and sunlight finally hit the display cases, we would roll back the heavy wooden shutters together. I would hold the latch, and Arthur would push the heavy timber skyward. His arms, thick and corded with muscle built over decades of manual labor, would strain for just a moment, and I could feel the heat radiating from his wool work vest as he stood beside me. During those early spring mornings, the market smelled of wet pavement, fresh basil brought in from the wholesale docks by South Street, and the faint, sweet scent of yeast from the bakery 2 doors down. We didn't talk about our lives outside the 4 walls of the shop. I never spoke to him about the quiet desperation of my tiny apartment, the leaky pipe under the bathroom sink that I couldn't afford to hire a plumber to fix, or the way my ex-husband's ghost seemed to linger in every unpaid letter sitting on my kitchen counter. Arthur never complained about the endless nights he spent awake, rubbing salve into Clara's stiff knuckles, or the mounting cost of her specialized ointments and prescriptions. Instead, we talked about the quality of the olive oil shipments. We discussed whether the provolone had aged 3 months or 6. We debated whether the butcher block needed another layer of mineral oil before the Saturday morning rush. These mundane details became the vessel for everything else. When Arthur complained that a batch of cured salami was too lean, he was telling me he was tired. When I spent 45 minutes reorganizing the condiment shelf so he wouldn't have to reach up to the top rack, I was telling him I saw how much his shoulder was hurting him. By the time Chloe was 7, she regarded the market as her second home. She would sit on an inverted wooden crate of San Marzano tomatoes in the back corner after school, doing her spelling homework with a stubby yellow pencil. Arthur rarely spoke to her directly in long sentences. He wasn't a man given to baby talk or fussing over children. But every afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock, he would walk past her crate, reach into his deep apron pocket, and produce a single, perfectly wrapped square of dark Gianduja chocolate, dropping it onto her open textbook without breaking his stride. "Focus on your long division, little girl," he'd say in his low, gravelly voice, continuing on toward the front window to flip the open sign to closed. Chloe adored him, though she was intimidated by his silence. She called him Mr. D'Agostino, pronounced with all the careful, exaggerated formality of a 7-year-old trying to act like a grown-up. She would watch his heavy hands carve a turkey or trim a loin of pork with absolute fascination. Sometimes, when he was working at the wooden block, she would copy his posture, squaring her small shoulders, setting her chin, and leaning over her drawing pad as if she were preparing a grand feast instead of sketching pictures of cats and fruit trees. It was during her 9th year that the unspoken tension between us began to feel like a physical presence in the room. A third person standing permanently in the narrow aisle between the cold display cases and the dry goods shelves. It wasn't that either of us sought it out or fed it with words. It was simply the inevitable weight of time and constant, quiet proximity. When you spend 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, within 3 feet of another person for years, you begin to breathe at the exact same tempo. You anticipate their movements before they make them. You know the exact pitch of their sigh when they're tired, and the subtle shift in their posture when they're worried about the electricity bill or the rising price of olive oil coming out of Sicily. I remember one particular summer afternoon when the humidity in Philadelphia was so thick it felt like trying to breathe under warm water. The shop's ceiling fans were whirring uselessly, merely pushing the stagnant, heavy air around the room. Arthur was standing by the open deli case, wiping down the stainless steel trays with a damp rag. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the thick, graying hair at his throat and the sharp line of his collarbone. I was standing near the front register, holding a heavy jar of pickled peppers that had become stuck. My hands were slick with sweat, and no matter how hard I twisted, the metal lid wouldn't budge. I let out a tiny, subconscious murmur of frustration. Without a word, Arthur stepped up behind me. He didn't take the jar out of my hands. Instead, he reached over my shoulders, his broad chest terrifyingly close to my back, and placed his large, calloused hands over mine. His palms were warm and dry. For 2 seconds, his strength enveloped mine. He applied a firm, measured twist, and the glass lid popped open with a soft hiss of released air. He didn't pull back immediately. For a fraction of a second, his breath touched the back of my neck, warm and steady. I froze, holding my breath, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The rubber gaskets stick in the heat," he said softly, his voice vibrating against my shoulder blades. Then he stepped back, leaving a cold expanse of air where his warmth had been. He walked over to the back sink, turned on the cold water tap, and washed his hands thoroughly with soap, staring intently at the white porcelain basin as if it held the answers to the universe. I stood by the register, holding the open jar, my fingers trembling so hard I almost dropped it. Neither of us said another word about the jar for the rest of the day. But the air in the store remained charged, heavy with a silent electricity that made every movement feel deliberate and weighted. Later that same autumn, a violent storm blew in off the Delaware River with unusual force. Rain lashed against the glass storefront so hard it sounded like handfuls of coarse gravel thrown against the window pane. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered, hummed loudly, and then went out entirely, plunging the deep interior of the shop into an amber, shadowed twilight. I was in the middle of restocking the top shelf, with small tins of oil-packed anchovies, standing on an old wooden stepladder. When the power cut out, I started in the sudden darkness, losing my balance for a fraction of a second. My left foot slipped off the narrow bottom rung. I didn't fall to the floor. Before I could strike the hardwood, Arthur was there. His hands came around my waist from behind, broad, heavy, warm hands, catching me cleanly and lifting me down to the floor as effortlessly as if I were a light parcel. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, I was pressed entirely against his chest. I could feel the cold brass buttons of his wool cardigan pressing through the thin cotton of my work shirt, the rhythmic rise and fall of his ribs, and the faint, permanent smell of tobacco, dried oregano, and cedar that followed him everywhere. His chin was right near my ear. I could hear his breath, sharp, caught tight in his throat. His hands didn't slide. They didn't linger or press. They stayed firmly, almost rigidly, on my waist until both of my feet were planted solidly on the floorboards. Then he let go. He stepped back so fast his heel struck the bottom shelf behind him, rattling the heavy glass bottles of balsamic vinegar. "You ought to watch that bottom step," he said. His voice was much lower than usual, thick and rough at the edges. "It's worn smooth over the years." "Thank you, Arthur," I whispered. My heart was hammering against my ribs so loudly I was certain he could hear it in the pitch-dark room. He didn't answer. He turned on his heel, walked straight into the back room, and I heard the heavy iron latch of the cellar door click shut with a definitive snap. He stayed down in the dark basement for 20 minutes, organizing wooden crates that didn't need organizing, until the power flickered back on and the neon sign in the front window hummed back to life. We never spoke about it. Not that afternoon, not the next week, not the next year. But after that storm, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere between us. The silence was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a physical container holding everything we were both choosing, every single minute of the day, not to say. Other people in the neighborhood noticed. You cannot hide that kind of hyper-awareness from people who watch you every day through the shop window. Mrs. Gable, a widow who had lived on Queen Street for 50 years and bought 2 thin slices of domestic ham every Wednesday at 11 o'clock, stood at the register one morning while Arthur was in the back, breaking down a side of veal. She watched me fold the brown paper around her ham with precise movements, then looked toward the curtained doorway where the sound of Arthur's heavy saw was steady and rhythmic. He doesn't look at anyone else like that, you know, she said quietly, her old eyes sharp and bright behind her thick trifocals. I froze, my fingers tangled in the roll of butcher tape. He's very attentive to all the customers. Mrs. Gable. I wasn't talking about the customers, Eleanor, she said gently, laying a dry, weathered hand over mine on the marble counter. I've watched that man since he was 20 years old. I knew his father when he ran this place. Arthur is a good man. A very good man. But he's a man who decided a long time ago to live his life inside a very small room. And he's made sure the door stays locked from the inside. I didn't answer her. I couldn't. To acknowledge what she was saying would mean admitting that the small room existed, and if I admitted that, I would have to figure out how to keep working next to him every morning without breaking down under the weight of it. There were other subtle moments when the neighborhood seemed to reflect what we were keeping hidden. Mr. Henderson, the postal worker who dropped off the mail at 10:15 every morning, would often glance between Arthur and me with a knowing, gentle smile. He never said a word, but he always placed Arthur's letters on Arthur's desk and handed mine directly to me, as if respecting the invisible dividing line that ran right down the center of the shop. One rainy spring afternoon, my ex-husband showed up at the market. He was standing outside near the display window, peering through the glass, looking disheveled, uncertain, and smelling faintly of cheap whiskey. He hadn't seen Chloe in 3 years. He stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing with a sharp, harsh tone. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice slurred at the edges, stepping toward the register. "I need to talk to you." Before I could even react, before the panic surging in my chest could manifest as words, Arthur stepped out from behind the meat counter. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his heavy hands or make a scene. He simply walked over to where my ex-husband stood, his broad frame blocking the aisle entirely, shielding me from view. Arthur stood 6'2", his broad shoulders filling his apron, his gray eyes dead and cold as winter river ice. He looked down at the man who had abandoned us. "We're closed for deliveries," Arthur said quietly. The voice was soft, but it carried the absolute weight of a steel door swinging shut. "I'm just here to see my wife," my ex-husband stuttered, taking a step back under Arthur's unyielding stare. "She's working," Arthur said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. "And you're leaving." My ex-husband looked at Arthur's hands, the thick, calloused fingers that broke down sides of beef every morning, and then looked past him at me. He swallowed hard, turned around, and practically ran out into the rain. Arthur stood by the front door until the man had disappeared around the corner of 4th Street. He didn't turn around to ask me if I was all right. He didn't ask who the man was, though he undoubtedly knew. He simply locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and went back to his butcher block. "Sweep the front floor, Eleanor," he said quietly from the shadows of the back counter. "We've got a long day tomorrow." That was how he protected me. He didn't offer romantic declarations or dramatic, heroic gestures. He built a wall of silence and absolute security around my life, ensuring that no harm could reach me or my daughter while we were under his roof. The obstacle between us was never an enemy. It wasn't a villain, a misunderstanding, or a cruel twist of fate. It was simply the fact that Arthur was an honorable man who loved his wife in the only way he knew how, and I was a woman who respected him far too much to ever ask him to be anything less than what he was. Clara's condition grew steadily worse as the years moved on. Her hands became gnarled and stiff, her strength fading until she could no longer manage the steep wooden stairs leading down to the shop. Arthur moved a small iron bed down into the back parlor behind the office so she wouldn't be isolated upstairs during the long daytime hours. During those hard months, the physical and emotional weight on his broad shoulders was immense. He worked 12 hours in the shop, then spent his nights cooking, washing linens, and caring for Clara with the same quiet, meticulous devotion he brought to his business. He looked perpetually exhausted, the dark circles under his gray eyes bruised and deep, his broad postures stooping slightly under the unseen load. I wanted, more than anything in the world, to help him. I wanted to stay late after closing, to cook their dinners, to scrub their living room floors, to take some of the physical burden off his calloused hands. Once, only once, I tried to step across that line. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday in late January. The store was closed, the front hanging sign flipped to dark. Arthur was sitting at his small wooden desk in the back corner, his head resting heavily in his broad hands, surrounded by stacks of unpaid medical bills and distributor receipts. I walked over to the desk, stopping just short of where he sat. I reached out my right hand, stopping it an inch short of his slumping shoulder. "Arthur," I said softly, the room so quiet I could hear the rain tapping on the back alley door. "Let me stay tonight. Let me make dinner for you and Clara. You can go upstairs and sleep for 3 hours. I'll take care of everything back here." He didn't look up immediately. When he finally raised his head, his face was drawn and pale. His gray eyes heavy with a sadness so deep it made my own chest ache with a sudden, sharp physical pain. He looked at my hand, hanging there in the cold air between us, close enough to feel the radiating heat of his heavy woolen sweater. "No, Eleanor," he said quietly. His voice was flat, settled, absolute. "That's not your job." "It doesn't have to be a job," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "I want to do it." "I know," he said. And for the first time in 10 years, he reached out and touched me, not with his skin, but by gently placing his index finger against the corner of the wooden desk, right where my shadow fell across the pine grain. "And that's exactly why you can't." He looked directly into my eyes then, with a clarity that felt almost terrifying in its exposure. "If you start doing that, Eleanor," he said, "I won't know where my life ends and yours begins. And I have to know where that line is every single morning. I have to stay on my side of it." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat tight and dry. "Okay," I whispered. "Go home to Chloe," he said softly, turning back to his open ledger. "She's waiting for you." I took my heavy coat off the peg, wrapped my wool scarf tightly around my neck, and walked out into the falling snow. That was the boundary. Stated plainly, accepted without anger or resentment, and kept with a discipline that broke my heart just a little bit more every single day. Time, as it always does, moved forward without asking our permission or waiting for us to be ready. When Chloe was 16, she decided she wanted to go to culinary school. She was remarkably bright, focused, and possessed a fierce determination to study culinary arts, a passion that had grown quietly during all those long afternoon hours spent sitting in the back of the market on tomato crates, watching Arthur prep meats and vegetables with surgical precision. She applied to a world-renowned program in New York, a school that was far beyond my financial reach as a single mother working for hourly wages at a neighborhood grocery store. We sat at the small laminate kitchen table on Catherine Street, surrounded by financial aid forms, tuition schedules, and high-interest loan applications that required collateral I simply did not possess. "I can take out private loans in my name, Mom," Chloe said, her young eyes bright with that fierce, unyielding optimism that hasn't yet bumped into the hard edges of reality. "I'll work night shifts in diner kitchens. I'll scrub pots. I can make it work." "We'll figure it out," I told her, putting on a brave face, Though late at night I would sit by the window with a lukewarm cup of tea, calculating numbers on a yellow pad that never, ever added up to what we needed. It was during that same spring that Clara passed away quietly in her sleep, with Arthur sitting in the small chair beside her bed, holding her hand. The funeral was small and solemn. Only a dozen neighborhood shopkeepers and longtime customers attended. I stood near the back of the small stone chapel, wearing my dark winter coat, holding Chloe's hand tightly in mine. Arthur stood at the front of the church, straight-backed, his face carved from gray marble, looking at the casket with a look of stoic grief that admitted no intrusion. When the service ended, he walked down the center aisle toward the heavy wooden doors. As he passed my pew, he paused for a fraction of a second. He didn't look at me, but he reached into his jacket pocket, took out a clean, ironed white linen handkerchief, and laid it quietly on the end of the wooden pew next to my purse. Then he kept walking out into the cold rain. 6 months later, Arthur sold the market. He didn't tell me he was planning to sell until the legal contracts were already signed and sealed. The buyer was a young commercial developer who wanted to convert the 90-year-old building into a modern coffee shop and upscale boutique. "It's time, Eleanor," Arthur said to me on our final afternoon together in the store. We had spent the long day packing up the remaining dry stock, sweeping the pine floors, and wiping down the marble counters one last time. My lower back isn't what it used to be. And the neighborhood is changing faster than I can keep up. "Where will you go?" I asked, standing behind the old brass register, holding the key loop he had handed me 12 years before. "Up north," he said, staring out the front window at the passing traffic. "A small place near Lancaster. My sister has a small farm up there with some apple trees. I'll help her with the garden and keep the fences mended." He didn't ask me to come with him. He didn't ask if I would miss him, or if I had loved him. He simply put on his heavy tweed coat, took his leather key loop out of his pocket, and laid it flat on the butcher block, right in that shallow, smooth dip his own hands had carved over 40 years of labor. "You've been a good worker, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet in the hollow, echoing room. "The best I ever had." "Thank you, Arthur," I said, my chest so tight I could barely draw breath. He stepped toward me, stopping at that familiar, invisible boundary 2 feet away. He looked at my face for a long time, taking in my eyes, my mouth, the silver hairs that had begun to appear at my temples over our years together. "Take care of the little girl," he said. He turned around, walked out the front door, and pulled the heavy metal grate down behind him for the last time. The heavy padlock clicked shut with a sharp, final sound that echoed down the quiet street like a gunshot. I didn't see him again for 9 years. Life filled up the vast space he left behind, as life always does, whether we want it to or not. I found a job managing a larger specialty gourmet market in Midtown. Chloe went off to school in New York, graduated near the very top of her class, and began working her way up through the demanding, high-pressure world of high-end restaurant kitchens in Manhattan and Brooklyn. She grew into a truly remarkable woman, strong, focused, with a deep, instinctual respect for raw ingredients and classic technique that she had absorbed without ever realizing it while sitting in the back room of D'Agostino and Sons. When she was 25, she decided to return to Philadelphia and open her own small restaurant, a tiny, 30-seat French-Italian bistro on a quiet corner in Queen Village, not 6 blocks from where Arthur's Market used to stand. She named it The Block. She worked 18 hours a day for 6 straight months, getting the space ready, sanding wooden tables by hand, designing seasonal menus, sourcing local agricultural suppliers. I spent my weekends helping her, painting plaster walls, sewing linen window curtains, feeling a deep, quiet pride that made every hard, lonely year of my youth feel entirely worth it. The week before the official public opening, Chloe decided to hold a private tasting dinner for family and close friends. She wanted her grandmother, my mother, Evelyn, to be the primary guest of honor. My mother was an extraordinarily difficult woman. She was from the old school, raised in a strict, sharp-tongued household where affection was withheld like a rare currency and criticism was offered continuously as a form of moral discipline. She had never quite forgiven me for my young divorce, nor had she ever truly approved of my 12 years spent working behind the counter of a neighborhood grocery store. She viewed life strictly through a narrow lens of social propriety and visible financial success, and she was not a person who gave praise under any circumstances. On the night of the private tasting, my mother sat at the head of the small wooden table in the center of the dining room. She was 78 then, her silver hair styled in a rigid permanent wave, wearing her best pearl necklace and a dark navy wool suit that smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender water. Chloe was visibly terrified. Her hands were shaking slightly as she brought out the dishes she had spent 3 days meticulously prepping, a multi-course meal designed to showcase everything she had learned in New York. The main course was a complex, slow braised beef short rib served over a bed of hand-milled yellow polenta, topped with a delicate reduction made from red wine, dried tart cherries, and 30-year-old aged balsamic vinegar. It was a dish that required immense patience, hours of skimming fat, straining through cheesecloth, and delicate seasoning adjustments. Chloe had spent 4 full hours on the reduction alone, standing over a heavy copper saucepan with a long wooden spoon, balancing the sweet, the savory, and the acid until it reached absolute perfection. She set the white porcelain plate down in front of my mother with a quiet, hopeful smile that broke my heart to watch. "This is my signature dish, Grandma," Chloe said, her voice tight with nervous anticipation. "I hope you enjoy it." My mother picked up her silver fork, cut a tiny piece of the tender meat, dipped it lightly into the dark reduction, and placed it in her mouth. She chewed slowly, deliberately, her face entirely unreadable, her eyes fixed on the blank wall opposite her. Silence hung over the room for 10 agonizing seconds. Then my mother set her fork down with a loud, sharp clink against the rim of the china plate. She pushed the plate 3 inches away from her with the tip of her finger. She looked up at Chloe, her mouth set in a thin, unforgiving line. "It's far too rich," my mother said, her voice flat, cold, and entirely dismissive. "The sauce is heavy, the meat is greasy, and the seasoning is completely unbalanced. You've drowned the whole dish in cheap vinegar." Chloe's face turned deathly white. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it was as if she had been struck across the face with an open hand. Her lips trembled violently. "Grandma, it's a traditional long braise," Chloe began, her voice cracking in the quiet dining room. "Leave the food," my mother said coldly, lifting her hand to cut her off mid-sentence. "Just leave the food where it is. Take the plate away. I won't have my stomach ruined before dessert." It was a breathtakingly cruel, completely unnecessary moment, the kind of casual, sharp malice that bitter older people sometimes exert when they feel their own control over the world slipping away. Chloe stood there for a second, completely frozen, staring down at the virtually untouched plate. A single heavy tear escaped her right eye and tracked down her cheek. She didn't say another word. She grabbed the plate with trembling hands, turned around, and walked quickly into the kitchen, the double doors swinging shut behind her with a soft thud. I stood up from my chair, my heart pounding with a sudden, boiling rage that made my vision blur at the edges. "Mother," I said, my voice shaking with restraint. That was completely uncalled for. "I am merely telling the girl the truth, Eleanor," my mother said, casually adjusting her pearl necklace without looking up at me. "If she expects to run a commercial business in this city, she needs to learn to take honest criticism from people who know better. Flattery won't pay her landlord." I didn't answer her. I couldn't trust myself to speak another word to her. I turned on my heel and walked straight through the swinging doors into the kitchen. Chloe was sitting on a stainless steel prep counter in the back, her knees pulled tight to her chest, sobbing quietly into her white linen apron. The heavy copper pan was still resting on the back burner of the stove, a small wisp of steam rising from the dark aromatic sauce inside. "Chloe, honey," I said, walking over to her instantly and wrapping my arms tightly around her trembling shoulders. "Don't listen to her. You know how she is. She's been like that her whole life. The food is magnificent. It's perfect. She hates it," Chloe sobbed, her words muffled against my neck. "She thinks I'm a total failure. I spent 3 full hours on that reduction alone, Mom. 3 hours." I held her tightly, stroking her hair, feeling a profound, aching, helpless anger. I wished, with every fiber of my being, that there was someone in the world whose authority she respected. Someone who could tell her the absolute truth about her skill. Someone who could undo the terrible damage my mother's coldness had inflicted on her young spirit. And that was precisely when the back alley delivery door chimed. It was 3 hours after the argument had taken place. The tasting dinner was long over. My mother had gone home in a hailed taxi, cold, silent, and unyielding to the very end. The few other guests had cleared out, and Chloe and I were sitting in the quiet, dim kitchen, wiping down the counters in a heavy, emotionally exhausted silence. The brass bell above the rear alley door rang once. I looked up, startled. No one was supposed to be coming through the back alley door at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. The heavy steel security door swung open slowly, and a tall man stepped out of the dark into the warm overhead light of the kitchen. He was significantly older now, his hair completely snow-white, his broad shoulders slightly more stooped under his coat, wearing a dark canvas work jacket and holding a faded wool cap in his rough hands. But his eyes were precisely the same, clear, gray, steady, and unhurried. It was Arthur. I stopped breathing entirely. The wet yellow sponge in my hand dropped into the stainless steel sink with a soft splash. "Arthur?" I whispered, my voice caught in my throat. He stood near the doorframe, taking off his wool cap, looking around the clean, modern commercial kitchen with a quiet, deliberate gaze. His eyes settled on me for a second, then moved to Chloe, who was standing near the stove. Her eyes still red-rimmed and swollen from crying. "I saw the small notice in the neighborhood paper last week," Arthur said. His voice was raspier now, like dry autumn leaves scraping over concrete, but the steady cadence was completely unmistakable. "Said the little girl was opening a place on 3rd Street. He stepped fully inside, pulling the heavy steel door shut behind him. He didn't come close to where we stood. He stopped at the far edge of the central prep table, holding his cap with both hands in front of his coat. "Arthur," Chloe breathed, her tears suddenly spilling over again, but for an entirely different reason now. You came down?" "I took the 2 o'clock bus down from Lancaster this afternoon," he said simply. "I wanted to see the place before you opened the doors to the public." His gray eyes drifted over to the copper pan, resting on the cold back burner, the pan containing the remaining short rib reduction that Chloe hadn't possessed the heart to dump into the trash. "You got any of that left in the pan?" Arthur asked, looking directly at Chloe. Chloe blinked, wiping her cheeks with the back of her wrist. The braise? Arthur, my grandmother said. I didn't ask what your grandmother said, Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping an octave into that firm, quiet, immovable register I had known for 12 years at the market. I asked if you have any left. Chloe nodded slowly. She reached for a clean, stainless steel tasting spoon, dipped it carefully into the cool, dark sauce in the pan, and walked over to hand it to him. Arthur took the spoon from her fingers. He didn't rush. He held it up to the overhead light, inspecting the deep color, the sheen, the consistency of the reduction. Then he put the spoon into his mouth. He closed his eyes. For 5 long, agonizing seconds, the kitchen was completely silent. The only sound in the entire building was the low, steady hum of the walk-in refrigerator in the corner. When he opened his eyes, he looked straight into Chloe's face. She's wrong, Arthur said plainly. The acid from the vinegar cuts the fat of the short rib perfectly. The tart cherry brings out the natural sweetness in the beef. It's balanced. It's precise. It's proper work. Chloe let out a long, ragged breath, a sob escaping her throat as she buried her face in her hands. You really think so? She asked, her voice tiny. I know so, Arthur said. He set the spoon down on the counter with a quiet, deliberate touch. I've been cooking and cutting meat for 50 years, little girl. You didn't learn how to balance a dish like that from a textbook in New York. You learned that from watching how things are done when people care about what they're making. He looked across the stainless steel table at me then. For the first time in 9 long years, his gray eyes held mine directly, without any pretense or distraction. There was no distance in them now, only a deep, quiet, unspoken history that flooded the room like sudden light through an opened door. She has good hands, Eleanor, he said to me softly. She got them from you. Arthur, I said, stepping forward toward him, my hand extending slightly before I could consciously stop myself. Why are you really here tonight? He reached deep into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, faded yellow manila envelope. It was tied securely with a piece of coarse brown butcher's twine, the exact same twine we used to bind the paper packages at D'Agostino and Sons. He set the envelope down on the clean stainless steel counter right between us. This belongs to Chloe, he said. I looked down at the envelope, then back up into his weathered face. What is it, Arthur? Open it, he said quietly. My fingers were trembling violently as I untied the stiff butcher's knot. Inside was a thick stack of official bank documents, stamped receipts, and a legal deed bound in heavy blue backing paper. I scanned the top document with blurred eyes. It was a formal receipt of payment in full for a commercial mortgage, a mortgage registered to the Block LLC, Chloe's restaurant. Attached to the back of it was a cashier's check receipt dated 5 years prior, made out directly to the Culinary Institute of America in New York for $78,000, paying off the absolute entirety of Chloe's student loans in one single lump sum payment. The donor's name on the bank wire transfer was listed simply as the D'Agostino Family Trust. I stared at the black print on the white paper. My vision swam. The numbers seemed to lift off the page and float in the quiet air. Arthur, I whispered, my voice cracking so severely I could barely articulate the syllables. What did you do? When I sold the building on South Street 9 years ago, Arthur said. Looking down at the wool cap in his hands, I didn't need the money from the sale. Clara's medical care had been paid for in full. My sister's farm up north was clear of debt. I didn't build that market alone for 40 years, Eleanor. You gave 12 years of your youth to that front counter. You worked double shifts when you were sick. You kept that store alive when the large corporate supermarkets moved in and tried to starve us out. He paused, taking a slow, deep breath that expanded his broad chest under his canvas coat. You wouldn't have taken a direct gift from me, he continued, his voice softer now than I had ever heard it. I knew you too well. You're far too proud. You would have told me it wasn't my place. You would have said it was too much for anyone to accept. He looked up, meeting my tear-filled eyes with an intensity that made my knees feel weak beneath me. So I sent the money straight to her school in New York, he said. And when she told the neighborhood paper she wanted to buy this building on 3rd Street, I went to the bank in town. I acted as the guarantor. I paid down the primary mortgage principal so her monthly payments would be low enough that she wouldn't starve while she was trying to build her dream. Chloe was staring at the legal papers spread across the counter, her hand pressed hard over her mouth, tears streaming down her face in silence. Arthur, she choked out. You paid for my entire tuition? You bought my building? I didn't buy anything for you, Arthur said, turning to her with a stern, gentle shake of his head. You bought this place with every single hour you spent sitting on those wooden tomato crates doing your algebra homework. You bought it with every lesson you paid attention to in the back of that shop. I just held the door open so you could walk through it when you were ready. I couldn't draw a proper breath. 12 long years of shared memory, every morning blue enamel mug of broth, every quiet gesture, every time he had pressed his fingers against the wooden desk instead of touching my hand, every painful distance he had so carefully maintained between us, recalibrated in my mind in a single overwhelming second. It hadn't been distance at all. It had been protection. It had been a devotion so absolute, so entirely selfless, that it required nothing in return from me, not even the relief or comfort of being thanked. He had loved us, not with grand speeches, not with passionate declarations, not by breaking his sacred wedding vows or destroying his quiet home, but by silently building an unbreakable fortress around us that would keep us safe long after he was gone. I walked around the stainless steel prep table. I didn't stop 2 feet away this time. I stepped straight up to where he stood by the alley door. I looked up into his weathered face, the deep lines carved around his gray eyes, the pure silver white of his hair, the mouth that had kept so many profound secrets for so many years. You never told me, I whispered, the tears running freely down my face now. All those years, working 3 feet apart, you never said a single word. Arthur looked down at me. His broad, heavy hand rose slowly from his side. Not with hesitation or uncertainty now, but with the quiet, unquestioned authority of a man who has finally completed his life's work. He reached out and gently touched the side of my cheek. His skin was rough, warm, and smelled faintly of cedar, wool, and the cold night air outside. His broad thumb stroked my cheekbone once, brushing away a hot teardrop that had gathered there. Some things don't ever need to be said out loud, Eleanor, he whispered softly. They just need to be done. He didn't pull me close to his chest. He didn't kiss my lips. The boundary we had built together remained completely intact, unbroken, and honored, even as his warm hand rested against my wet skin for those 5 slow, beautiful seconds. Then he let his hand drop back to his side. He picked up his dark wool cap, pulled it down over his silver hair, and looked over at Chloe. Open those front doors on Monday morning, little girl, he said, a faint, incredibly rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. And don't you dare change a single thing about that short rib sauce. He turned on his heel, opened the heavy steel delivery door, and stepped out into the dark, damp alley. We stood together in the quiet, brightly lit kitchen, listening to the rhythmic sound of his heavy footsteps fading down the wet asphalt outside until there was nothing left to hear except the slow, steady beating of our own hearts. Arthur lived for another 4 years on his sister's quiet farm in Lancaster. He never married again. He never moved back to the city. Every month on the 1st, a small white card would arrive in the mail at the block, postmarked from a tiny rural post office in Lancaster County. Inside, there was never a written letter, only newspaper clippings from local agricultural papers about winter harvests, or a recipe clipped from an old Italian cooking magazine, carefully wrapped around a single square of dark Gianduja chocolate for Chloe. I went up to see him only once, 2 years before he passed away. It was a crisp, clear afternoon in late October. I drove up through the rolling hills to the farm alone. He was sitting on a simple wooden porch bench, watching the autumn wind move through the tall dried cornstalks in the front field. I walked up the porch steps and sat down next to him on the wooden bench. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about the money, or the shop on South Street, or the long years we had spent standing 3 feet apart in that small shadowed room. We simply sat together for 3 quiet hours, watching the long shadows lengthen across the golden fields, our shoulders almost touching in the chill air, sharing a silence that was complete, whole, and entirely unfrightened. When I finally got up from the bench to leave, he walked down the porch steps with me to my car. He looked at me for a long, unhurried moment, then reached out his right hand and took mine, holding it firmly, warmly, for the first and last time in our entire lives. "You did good, Eleanor," he said softly. "We did good, Arthur," I answered. He nodded once, let go of my hand, turned around, and walked slowly back up toward the house. I think a great deal about restraint these days, about how our modern world insists that every single feeling must be spoken aloud, claimed, possessed, and consumed in order to be considered real or meaningful. We are taught by everything around us that love is only valid if it breaks down doors, makes loud demands, and leaves a heavy footprint for everyone else to see. But I know better now. I know that the strongest, most enduring love is sometimes the love that chooses to stay behind the line, the love that chooses to protect rather than possess, to give completely without ever holding out a hand for repayment, to build a room so quiet, strong, and safe that the person inside it never even realizes they are being sheltered from the storm until long after the rain has stopped. Arthur never gave me a promise. He never gave me a gold ring. He never gave me a single romantic night. He gave me my life. He gave my daughter her future. And he left me with a memory so pure and untarnished that time can never fade it, and age can never wear it away. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.